Welcome to the Power Factor Show. Episode 137. Sponsored by Rainier Ballistics, Hodgdon Powders, and JPL Precision.
Welcome to Power Factor. I'm Rick, and I'm here in my garage, and I'm doing a little solo episode. I don't know what the other guys are doing. They're busy. Larry's working every day. What's up with that? So I'm just going to kind of take charge here for today. First things first, we're going to do the usual housekeeping, get that out of the way. We have a trivia question out there. Everybody's on the edge of their seat waiting for the answer. And the question was, what does the Beretta Trident logo signify? And here it is. In quotations, dare in braca, or hit the target. The circle arrow on the left represents a warning shot across the bow. The arrow on the right represents a shot across the stern. The center circle arrow represents, if the ship does not yield, a direct hit. This logo was created by Gabriella D'Annunzio, and permission was granted for Mr. Beretta to use this logo. So there's the answer, and that explanation was provided by our winner, Andrew K. Andrew, give us a call. You won the shotgun book from Steve's Reloading episode. Just get in touch with us, and the book is yours. Thank you very much for playing. Now we're going to do, going to do another Reader's Right episode. This is, we get a lot of questions, some of them from YouTube, some of them come in through email, and we just find that they've got maybe a little bit more general interest than some other questions, so we just kind of compile them and put together an episode that revolves around the questions. So let's get started on these. This first one is from Bob, and it's about a 1911, and he's having a little trouble. He's got a quick question. He's had a Springfield 1911 for 16 years. He's never shot it well, so it doesn't shoot it very much. But he's trying to kind of get on top of what the issue is, because he'd like to shoot it in IDPA. So the problem is, he took it out, and it shoots 5 inches low at 7 yards. The 2 rounds were touching on the target, so the gun is accurate. I mean, that's one of the things people will talk about, their gun placing a group 3 inches away from the bullseye and saying the gun isn't accurate. Well, the group is your accuracy level. If you've got all of your rounds in a little group like this, that gun is accurate. What you need to do is get that group over onto the target. So he's got 2 touching shots at 7 yards, but they're 5 inches low. Now he took the gun to a gunsmith who wanted to check it out. The gunsmith recommended he get a trigger job and adjust the barrel lockup. He showed me his 1911, how light the trigger was compared to his. He's sold, that is, Bob was pretty much sold on getting the trigger job, but he still has a question about adjusting or fixing the lockup. I have no reason to doubt him, but at the same time, if I'm going to spend a bunch of money, he'd rather spend it on ammo than getting the barrel fixed. And what's the issue? Now, I thought if the issue really was a mechanical lockup issue, you probably would have an accuracy issue, not just a point of impact, point of aim issue. So like, for instance, if there was a bad fit of the lower barrel lugs on the slide stop pin, or a bad fit of the upper barrel lugs in the slide, you'd have an inconsistent fit that would be throwing rounds all over the place. So my first cheapest guess was, check the bushing. It just could be a matter of the bushing being drilled off slightly off center, and that is going to throw your rounds off. If the barrel is just tilting down a little too low, replacing the bushing might be enough to fix it. Now John, our resident gunsmith at JPL, he had a little more detailed response, and maybe he thought, let's go down. It's possible that there is a mechanical issue that we should pursue, but I like the cheap fix first. And if you're going to start throwing money at it, obviously you'd like kind of an educated guess as to what's wrong with it. But you can get an aftermarket bushing that's pre-fit to your barrel for about 35 bucks. And for me, I'd start there. Throw a bushing on there. It could be the bushing fit isn't all that great anyway, although the fact that you can put 2 touching rounds at 7 yards would tend to suggest that the gun is actually pretty accurate. But in order to get those rounds on target to raise your point of impact 5 inches at 7 yards, there's not going to be enough adjustment available, I don't think, in the standard set of sights. So you probably are going to have to look at adjusting something. But before, say, paying for a new barrel or something like that, I'd probably just throw a bushing in there, high quality bushing that's a good fit on the barrel, and see if that doesn't fix it. So that's my fix for the barrel, or my suggestion for a fix. Now for the trigger, I commented that I don't think very light triggers are necessary for good accuracy. You do need a trigger that's consistent. You don't want it varying from one pull to the next. I mean, you don't want it to be 3 pounds on the first pull, 4.5 pounds the next, 4 pounds on the next. You want it to be consistent within a few ounces on every pull, but it doesn't have to be especially light. I've shot some guns, Steve's gun, his STI Edge. I think the trigger on that's about 1.5 pounds, and I've shot that a few times. And if you're used to that, you're accustomed to that, that's a safe, usable trigger pull, but I've just never felt like I was going to get that much benefit from the trigger being that light. And also, since my competition guns and my carry guns are sometimes interchangeable, I don't want a really light trigger pull on a gun that's going to be carried. And I also don't want dramatically different trigger pulls on similar guns that are used in competition and for carry. So for instance, if I had a tricked out single stack 45 that I was using in CDP division for IDPA, single stack division for USPSA, and had a 1.5 pound trigger, and my carry gun, similar single stack with a 3.5 or 4.5 pound trigger, like I think most people have on their carry guns, I don't like this idea of I'm picking up a gun and I don't know what the trigger is going to be like. I mean, I want to have a familiar trigger and an expectation of how it's going to run. So rather than have dramatically varying trigger pulls, I like about a 3 to 4 pound trigger. Most of my guns actually run between 3.25 and 3 3/4, and that's about the range that I like it. You can go lighter, you can go heavier, but what I recommend is consistency and pick a pull weight that you're comfortable with. I think as people's skill gets greater, they like a lighter and lighter trigger pull, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but you do want to take into account the different factors. And also an extremely light trigger can be not as durable, not as safe. I think modern gunsmithing, modern materials and parts make light trigger pulls more durable and reliable than they used to be. But you know, a 3 pound trigger will probably last you tens and tens of thousands of rounds and won't need any messing with it. A really light trigger, you might need some tweaking, maybe an adjustment to the springs, or maybe resurfacing the sear or something to maintain that light pull and maintain its safety and reliability. So I'd say, you know, if you've got a trigger and it's manageable, I wouldn't throw a lot of money at a trigger job. I'm aware of trigger jobs that start at $200 plus parts, and I'm aware of trigger jobs where somebody will charge you $50 to do a little massaging of the factory parts, maybe tweak the springs a little bit. So as long as the work is well done, I'd say it's hard to go wrong with an inexpensive, good trigger job, but I certainly wouldn't start throwing hundreds of dollars at it unless there's really something wrong with it that you don't think you can deal with. So that's my answer. Thanks for the question, Bob. Now here's a question from an entirely different Bob, and a completely different question as well. And what Bob's asked about, he says he's been listening to the podcast, which is always a good start. I suggest actually that you watch it, but listening is fine. And he's listening to it on his commute, which I find to be pretty popular. And he's got a 37-mile commute, so he's got plenty of time to listen to us jabbering about it. So he's recently begun shooting USPSA, and he's begun analyzing his scores in a method as demonstrated by Larry and I on episode 98, Tracking Match Performance. He's begun to identify areas that need improvement, and he's working on things that can be handled through dry fire practice. Unfortunately, at his local range, where he has his monthly matches, they don't have any kind of a training program, and I think that's something that a lot of people face. A lot of people who are new to the sport of practical pistol competition, they're aware of what they need to practice, but it's sometimes very difficult to find a place to do it. You go to a public range, you're allowed to shoot 1 shot per second. You're not allowed to draw. You've got kind of a bowling alley type arrangement where all of your rounds have to travel straight down range. So if you're going to transition among targets, the targets have to be very close together, like multiple bullseyes on a single piece of paper, that kind of thing. And so sometimes it's difficult to practice this stuff other than in dry fire. And Bob says he's recently purchased a shot timer, and he's made adjustments to his gear. He's built several target stands that he can quickly assemble and place at the club. He watched the Reading Rainbow episode and was interested in Ben Steger's book and Steve Anderson's book, Principles of Performance. And my concern at this point is similar to that when I learned how to play golf many years ago. His scores were improved as he self-taught, but he didn't see dramatic improvement until he worked with a pro. And he recalled in one other episode, Caleb commented on this very subject. And what have you done in the area of self-improvement? Well, like Bob, I'm pretty much a self-taught shooter. I started shooting when I was a kid. I mean, my dad showed me, where the trigger is and which end the bullet comes out of when I was 10 years old. I think that's not an uncommon experience in the United States. But until I started shooting in pistol competition, that was all I really did. I mean, I would go to the range and just do some kind of informal plinking. But then when I started in competition, I knew there were shortcomings in my abilities, but I wasn't really sure what to do about it. And I commented to Bob, I'm almost entirely self-taught. I've received no formal instruction beyond a basic NRA pistol course in 1990. Everything I've learned, good and bad, is from observation and repetition. So I go to a match, I look at how the best shooters shoot, I see how the best shooters are doing something different than I'm doing, so I try to do it the way they do it. I mean, when I started shooting, I think this is something that came out in one of the earliest episodes that we did a couple of years ago, because I'd been studying at the altar of Jeff Cooper since I was a little kid. I mean, since I was 12 years old, I was reading Cooper on handguns and whatnot. I held the way Jeff and God intended, with the 2 thumbs up grip, both thumbs tight on the safety, using my push-pull dynamics to get good solid grip on the gun. And then when I went to a match for the first time, I noticed that nobody else was holding the gun that way. Everybody else was using some form of isosceles type squared up position with their 2 thumbs forward type grip. And so I thought, well, if all the guys are beating me or shooting the gun that way, I should probably shoot it the way they do. And of course, my shooting did improve dramatically, but that was one of those examples of, not self-improvement so much as just being smart enough to accept that when somebody else is doing something better, do it the way they do it. And then the other aspect of that is, I think we tend to not want to practice the things that we don't like doing. And it's not necessarily something that we're not good at, but the reason that we don't practice it is because we don't like it, and then we're not good at it because we don't practice it. And for a lot of people, that's things like weekend shooting. If you're going to spend, I think there's good reason not to practice weekend shooting. Not as a blanket, condemnation of practicing weekend shooting, but if you, let's say, go to the range and you have an hour to practice, and you're going to put 100 rounds down range, are you going to get more benefit from practicing, say, freestyle shooting for that 100 rounds, or practicing 100 rounds of weekend? If you go to the typical match, you're probably going to, let's say it's a 150 round match, a typical USPSA match, 150 rounds. You're probably going to shoot 140 rounds freestyle and maybe 10 rounds weekend. So how much time and energy do you want to spend practicing for that small proportion of the total match? And so I think in that sense, it makes sense. If you have limited resources for practicing, limited time, especially limited ammunition, you don't want to spend a lot of time practicing something that isn't going to be seen very much in matches. I mean, I've made the same comment about IDPA. You're rarely going to see 35-yard shots, although the rule book says right in there, occasional shots out to 35 yards are allowable. You're rarely going to see a 35-yard shot. So somebody who does practicing for IDPA, even if it's fairly intense practice, I wouldn't be surprised if very few people practice 35-yard shooting at all as preparation for IDPA competition. I think in general, good marksmanship. Practicing good marksmanship is a good idea regardless of what you're doing. I mean, if you wanted to, say, do a practice session where you started by shooting a group and finished by shooting a group, concentrating only on shooting the smallest possible group you can, that's not a bad idea, because accuracy is always good. You know, if you're called on to make a headshot at 20 yards, you want to be able to do that. But again, in the grand scheme of things, how often are you called upon to do that? And if you have limited practice time and resources, how much time do you want to invest in something that you're rarely going to do and is rarely going to have a large impact on your match score? And as you become a better shooter, obviously you're going to have to start identifying these areas that are your weaknesses and improving them. I never did a whole lot of weekend practice, but I never felt that weekend shooting was a real weakness of mine, and I based that on comparing my weekend shooting to what I saw other people doing. I mean, if I went to a match and my weekend strings really sucked, then I might say, okay, a little bit of weekend practice would help. And I did do a little bit of weekend practice, but I found on, especially like on classifiers that have a weekend string or something, I never found that my weekend shooting is what was holding me back, so I didn't invest an exceptional amount of time into that. But if that's something that you find is really holding you back, I mean, let's say you feel like, geez, you know, I'm in C class, I've been in C class, I think if I could shoot better weekend, maybe I'd be in B class, you know, then go for it. But I think you have to identify the little bits and pieces that you need to improve across the board in your shooting and work on all of them. And each of them will provide a little incremental improvement in your overall performance. And I commented, for instance, like reloading. I see a lot of what I call these beauty passes on YouTube, where somebody's standing, you know, perfectly erect, ready for the timer, and they execute this awesome reload. And I think, okay, in match conditions, you almost literally never do a reload like that. You're always doing your reloading while you're moving. So if you're going to practice reloads, you maybe want to stand in front of a mirror and see how you're doing it, looking for wasted motion and get a good reloading motion. But this reload that's executed like this is a reload you rarely do. It'd be a much more valuable exercise to, say, take two shooting boxes, put them 20 feet apart, and attempt to complete your reload before you arrive at the second box, and then move those boxes closer and closer together. And it's sort of like working with a shot timer. Once you've mastered the 20-foot reload, move the box into 3 feet, for instance, and now practice your reload, because you're supposed to be reloading when you're moving. So practice those reloads under circumstances that you'd actually see in a match, and your match performance is going to be improved to a greater extent than practicing these kind of static movements that you can see if your technique is good or not. Again, for instance, standing in front of a mirror or shooting a video of yourself, going through the perfected reloads. But it's sort of like a parlor trick. It's like the guy who can perform a reload and catch the empty mag in midair. You know, that looks really cool, but when are you ever called upon to do that? Why would you waste your time developing a skill like that really doesn't ever get you any kind of a benefit? And I think just standing here doing static repetitious shooting drills like that are sort of like that, because again, you don't do that in competition. You want to perfect that technique, but then once the technique is perfected, practice it in an environment that will improve your match score. And I'd say do that while you're moving. And again, Steve and I commented early on in the show that you always want to go for what we call the low-hanging fruit. You want to improve the things that are going to get you whole seconds of improvement rather than tiny fractions of an improvement. So, for instance, I was watching a video of IDPA match, and the video on the screen showed the shot splits. And typical splits for shooters who are shooting around cover at partial targets and whatnot, stuff that you actually find in a match, as opposed to, you know, standing wide open, square up to a target that's exactly 7 yards away, that kind of thing. And in an actual match environment, typical splits were about 0.25 second. And if you got really good, you can knock that down to 0.15 second. But in a 10-round stage, 1/10 of a second, 100th of a second, you know, you're looking at a second of improvement Whereas what you should be looking at is seconds of improvement in the other things. So again, you have to improve. All your skills should be going, you should see improvements across the board, but look for those things that give you the biggest improvement for the least amount of effort is what it amounts to. It's like an 80-20 kind of a deal. You can get an 80% improvement by putting in 20% of the time, that if you flip that around, 80% more effort would only get you another 20% improvement. So I 80-20 a lot of stuff, whether it's at work or at home, whatever, shooting, you've got to get the maximum benefit for the time and energy you have available to put into it. So there you go, Bob. Diligent practice on the things that are important, but be mindful of what it is you're trying to accomplish and the benefits that you can get from that time and energy that you're putting into your practice sessions. And I also heard from, who was this? Andrew. This is an interesting one. Andrew says he's been watching the YouTube videos. There's another loyal follower, and he loves the great information. And he wanted to ask about a specific modification to his Gen 4 Glock backstrap, the optional backstrap, and would it be legal for IDPA stock service pistol division? Now, anytime you're talking about a modification and is it legal for stock service pistol, you have to be kind of, be aware of what's in the rule book. Most of the modifications that I find that people are asking about, can I do this? It's almost always, I find, something that, yes, it's legal to do it, but the second part of the question is, and can I do it, and then if I do, am I still legal for stock service pistol division? People want to shoot for some reason in stock service pistol, and so they want to make as many modifications as they can while retaining this stock legality. So what he's done is, he's taken this factory beaver tail backstrap, which is a part that you can add to kind of change the girth of the grip on the Gen 4 Glock, and he's cut the backstrap off the bottom portion so as to mimic a grip force adapter, which, since it is not a factory part, is illegal for SSP. So what he wants to know is if he can modify this factory part to kind of mimic this aftermarket part that he suspects isn't legal. And I said, Andrew, I looked at the new rule book. Now, the new rule book does not take effect until October. But I feel like here we are, the first part of August, people are asking questions now. If they're going to make a modification of their gun, they're not interested in a modification that they can use for 2 or 3 months. They want to know if going forward this is going to be legal. So going forward on the show, here we are, the first week of August, we'll probably start answering questions about IDPA referencing the new rule book, which again isn't in effect yet, but I think anytime you're asking a question, you're thinking long term. Is this going to be legal or not? So I looked in the new rule book, which includes rules changes. They've integrated some of the clarifications that were previously found on the IDPA website, and the rules that apply are 8.2.1.3.16. Stippling and texturing may be performed on readily replaceable parts of the grip frame, such as replaceable backstraps. So clearly, if it's a removable part, like for instance a conventional gun, we think of classic guns that have removable grip panels. Modern guns that have mostly they're a texturized plastic molding, you can't mess with that main part of the frame, but if there's a replaceable backstrap part, that part in the rules is treated pretty much like replaceable grip panels would be on something like a revolver or a 1911. But there's also this rule, 8.2.1.4.1, externally visible modifications other than those listed in the permitted modifications section aren't legal. So the problem is you can modify stipple, checker, melt, whatever, the backstrap, but it has to be something that is in the permitted modifications, and cutting up, changing the dimensions essentially of that interchangeable part isn't legal. Now my comment then is that you could probably get away with it. people that aren't familiar with Gen 4 Glocks, like me, I would look at it, and I don't know if you've cut it up or not. But I would say if you cut off part of the back strap, you violated 8.2.1.4.1. So here's a question from Mark, and it regarded the IDPA reloads episode. And I received a lot of feedback on that, and a lot of it related to kind of the imperfect science of the reload times. Because each reload included shot-to-shot string times, it included a draw, a shot, a reload, and another shot. So when I conclude, a reload takes 4 seconds, if you look at the scores that show a time on a given string of 4 seconds, that included a draw, for instance, that could be as much as 2.5 of that 4 seconds. But again, we're talking about match conditions rather than this kind of a beauty pass where you're standing there executing perfectly. I was thinking more along the lines of a reload that's being done while you're kneeling and scrunched up shooting around a barrel, and the target is not 7 yards away. Maybe it's a partial target, maybe it's got some hard cover. And so even though the string times did include a draw that would add to the time, I believe that was sort of made up for by the fact that you're standing square to the target that's 7 yards away. There's no cover, there's no hard cover on the target, there's no non-threats around. And so even though you could subtract the draw time if you want from each of those string times, I think that the fact that it wasn't really match conditions means it's going to be about a wash. The time for the draw is going to be about equivalent to the compromise that you're going to find in a match from having to, for instance, if you're shooting around cover, you're leaned out like this while you're shooting, it's perfectly allowable to do your reload like this while you're leaning out. But that reload is certainly going to be slower than if you're standing like this and doing your reloads. So again, if you're kneeling and leaning out like this, the reload's going to be slower still. If the target has hard cover or it's near a non-threat, slower still. So I think if you're looking at realistic loading times, you don't necessarily want to base your judgment on how long a reload takes by going down in your garage and again standing in front of a mirror and doing these perfect reloads and concluding that that's your actual reload time under match conditions. One of the guys that replied to me after the IDPA reload episode said, I thought that my reloads were considerably better than they were. I was thinking they were 2 or 3 seconds. But then I saw your episode and they were 4 or 5 seconds, so I decided to watch a video of myself shooting a match and time my reloads, and sure enough, his reloads that he thought were 2 or 3 seconds, because that's what he was getting in practice, under match conditions were 4 or 5 seconds because of these compromising conditions that you'll find under actual competition that will slow you down relative to doing these kind of textbook reloads that you see people demonstrating and saying, oh, see, look, I can do a 1 second reload. Well, okay, you just did do a 1 second reload, but where in a match are you going to have the opportunity to do a reload of that type? And it rarely comes up. Yeah, and I just didn't want to try to adjust the times. I mean, if you start trying to adjust them, then how much, let's say, for instance, if I wanted to try to turn these string times into something that more closely approximated just a reload, and I wanted to remove the draw time from it, how much do you remove? I mean, if you've got a perfect reload and a perfect draw, maybe that's 2 seconds. But if you've got it, so if I take 1 second off of each string to account for the draw, well, the marksman class shooters, their draws are probably 2 seconds. So if they're a marksman, should I take 2 seconds off, and they're an expert, I take a second off? I just think that kind of muddies the waters. But I think the actual truth, if you were looking for it in that episode, was the difference in the time the time difference amongst the different reloads. Now, of course, again, we're talking about the new rule book. The tactical reload and the retention reload that were in the previous rule books have been replaced by what they still call it the tactical reload, but it's neither of the old tactical reload or reload with retention that was being tested in episode 128. Essentially what they've done is just said, if you're reloading your gun when there's a round in the chamber and the magazine is empty or has rounds in it, you must retain that magazine and it must be stowed, and essentially stowed before you fire a shot. So if you drop a mag on the ground, you can pick it up and stow it. You can go through all these different permutations as long as they all end up with the full mag in the gun, the depleted or empty mag in your pocket. The rulebook no longer lists these sequence of events that constitute the tactical reload and this other sequence of events that constitute the reload with retention. They're just lumped together into a single retention reload that they've decided to call a tactical reload, which I thought was sort of confusing since, of course, the previous reload was called the tactical reload, one of the previous reloads, but essentially all of the elements of the tactical reload are there, but without this kind of strict sequence of events that used to be listed in the previous rulebook. So the next question is from Dean. Dean says, if a shooter safely draws and then while extending out to the target, but not fully extended and on target, has an accidental discharge, is it a disqualification? The shooter came close to hitting the target, the muzzle was clearly downrange, and the bullet struck the berm. But both the shooter and the SO knew that the gun fired early. Should the shooter be DQ'd? And my response to Dean was, the rulebook says a round that strikes the ground within 6 feet of the firing position will result in a DQ. I would not want to go down the road of disqualifying someone for a round that was fired prematurely if it did not also go through a prop or over a berm. At what point do you consider any miss to be a DQ? I mean, if the guy draws his gun, extends out towards a target, and a round discharges and hits the berm, at what point is that accidental, and at what point is it just a miss? I mean, you can't disqualify somebody for missing, and there's no way you're going to be able to try to quantify it. Like, well, if the bullet lands within a foot of the target, it's a miss, and but if it's more than 2 feet from the target, then that's an AD and it's a disqualification. I mean, the whole point of what we're trying to do is make sure that the rounds are safely going into the berm. If a round is fired at a target, in the direction of a target, and hits the berm, I don't see how you could possibly disqualify somebody for that. Then Dean came back with, thanks so much. I told him what he wanted to hear. He agrees with me, but it was another safety officer who thought the guy should have been DQ'd and asked me to find some evidence for not DQing him. Well, I don't know what you can do other than look in the rule book. You know, really, the rule book says if the round doesn't land within 6 feet of the shooter, and even then, if it lands within 6 feet of the shooter, there can't be a nearby target. So if, let's say you've got a target that's 6 feet away, and you miss that target, that's not a DQable offense. It has to be a situation where you really are clearly not engaging a target, and the round is clearly not gone in the direction of the target. Unless you have a range rule that regards round impacting the deck that's different from what's in the rule book, or of course a round that goes over the berm, whether it's accidental, incidental, premature or not, a round goes over the berm, I think you should be done. The only rule that applies is the one about impacting within 6 feet of the shooter, and then only if there's no target in the vicinity. So if the round impacts the berm, there's no reason to look any deeper into it than that. I mean, that's, I think, end of story right there. If the round goes into the berm, you can shake your head, shooter and SO alike, and go, oh, that one got away a little early, but as long as it goes into the berm, it's a safe shot. No DQ. Those of you who are IDPA safety officers, you probably are either have just taken the safety officer recertification test or are studying for it. I just took the safety officer instructor test a couple of weeks ago, And it was an interesting test. My understanding is there's a pool of 200 questions, and your specific test will be 100 of those 200 questions. And so it's revolving, no two people will take the same test. The answers for any two people, even if they did take the same test, the answers and questions wouldn't be in the same order and whatnot. So they've done a pretty extensive planning in advance to make sure that the test is fair and valid, etc., etc. But there's some interesting stuff in here. A lot of the changes have to do with staff duties, responsibilities. They've broken the safety officer duties down into, I think they call it a chief safety officer, primary safety officer, scoring safety officer. And there's a lot of stuff there. They've changed some procedures, but a lot of it's the same. I mean, we'll do episodes specifically on the rule book, but there's stuff that I think changes that a lot of people were interested in seeing. Springfield XD pistols have been moved to all striker fire pistols are now in stock service pistol, if they're stock or reasonably stock. They increased, after increasing the CDP weight limit from 41 ounces to 42 ounces, they've now instituted a 43 ounce weight limit across the board, which I think is welcome and makes sense. So there's all kinds of detail changes in here, but we'll get into, in future episodes, we'll get into just kind of a breakdown of all this stuff and how matches that take place in 2014 after the new rule book takes effect are going to differ from the matches that we've been shooting for the last 15 years. So along those lines, and that theme, we're going to have a trivia question relating to the new rule book. And the prize is a $50 certificate for K-Rounds holsters. If you watched the last episode, we did the tour of K-Rounds, and so if you were wowed by their trick inside the waistband appendix holster, the way I have been, he'll give you a leg up, $50 towards the purchase of a K-Rounds holster. And the trivia question is, from the new rule book, the guidelines for awards at IDPA matches previously or currently under the 2005 rule book suggests that about 1/3 of the competitors at a given match should receive an award, about 1 in 3. The new rule book changes that to a different ratio, and your trivia question is, what is the suggested 1 in X number for awarding prizes under the new October 2013 rule book? So send your questions and answers to powerfactorshow@gmail.com. You can find the show, of course, at powerfactorshow.com. And if you're a big fan of Facebook, I'm sure you already know how to find us on Facebook. And so until then, I am Rick, and we'll see you at the range.